Topic 3. Vulnerability to sexual violence. Decades of national and international research demonstrates people with intellectual disability are at increased risk of sexual violence and abuse. Between 50 and 99% of people with an intellectual or psychosocial impairment will experience sexual assault in their lifetime. Sexual assault against people with intellectual disability is more likely to be repeated or continuing, and is more likely to be severe or violent compared with the general population. As in the general population, sexual violence against people with intellectual disability is gendered. Women and girls with intellectual disability are the overwhelming majority of victims of sexual assault. The majority of women with intellectual disability have been sexually exploited by the time they reach adulthood. At the same time, men and boys are also vulnerable to sexual violence and abuse. Men with an intellectual disability experience a greater risk of victimisation than men in the general population. Multiple intersecting factors increase the vulnerability of people with intellectual disability to sexual violence and abuse. These factors are well described in this statement by the New South Wales Attorney General's Department. People who have cognitive impairment are more vulnerable to sexual assault and abuse because they depend on others for assistance with daily life. Other factors that are likely to increase vulnerability to criminal victimisation are their impaired judgment, deficits in adaptive behaviour, accompanying physical disabilities which may inhibit the person conveying sexual victimisation, the high-risk environments in which they live and work, their lack of knowledge about sexual rights, and the attraction of some abusers to environments in which they will encounter vulnerable victims. Understanding the range of personal and social factors that increase the vulnerability of people with intellectual disability to sexual violence and abuse can assist service providers and support workers to proactively identify and respond to risks. For example, through providing tailored sexuality education and teaching protective behaviours. However, a singular emphasis on vulnerability places the responsibility for stopping sexual violence and abuse in the hands of the individuals themselves, and neglects the wider social responsibility to value the lives and experiences of people with intellectual disability and to detoxify environments that make people with disability vulnerable to sexual assault. Personal factors, including socialised behaviours demonstrated by many people with intellectual disability, can be exploited by perpetrators and can increase people's vulnerability to sexual violence and abuse, including a desire to please others, high levels of compliance and acceptance of what is done to them by others, especially authority figures, a belief that someone else should decide whether or not they should have sex or be sexual, difficulty or inability to negotiate sexual relationships, for example, consenting to some sexual activity but not all. Difficulties with communication can make it hard to report abuse and may be exploited by perpetrators. Social factors typical of the lives of many people with intellectual disabilities can increase people's vulnerability to sexual violence and abuse, including limited or no sex education, resulting in restricted knowledge and understanding of sex, sexuality and abuse. Messages from others that sexual behaviour is not okay, resulting in secrecy which increases risk and risky behaviours. Congregation in closed environments, including accommodation, education and employment settings, with a lack of external oversight where abuse may be perpetrated unseen by others. Reliance on others for intimate personal care needs, providing opportunities for perpetrators of sexual violence to have intimate contact with victims that may be used to mask abuse. Limited access to supportive relationships and having no one to discuss sex and relationships with. Limited choice of partners and friends due to isolation and the lack of social opportunities. Poverty and the use of sex to meet everyday needs, for example, transport, food, cigarettes. Social myths and attitudes about people with intellectual disability can also increase their vulnerability to sexual violence and abuse. For example, beliefs that people with intellectual disability are like children and/or are asexual. People with intellectual disability do not attract attention because they are sexually undesirable and/or no one would take advantage of someone with a disability. People with intellectual disability live in institutions where they are protected. People with intellectual disability need to be protected or prevented from sexual activity, and this can be achieved by withholding sexual education and/or sterilisation. Social myths and attitudes can minimise or deny people's experience of sexual violence and abuse. For example, beliefs that people with an intellectual disability are unable to distinguish fantasy from fact. People with intellectual disabilities do not feel hurt by abuse or exploitation because they cannot fully understand what happened. People with disabilities should be grateful for any sexual contact, as no one would want to have sex with them. Social myths and attitudes can blame people for experiences of sexual violence and abuse. For example, beliefs that people with an intellectual disability behave in ways that invites or provokes victimisation. People with intellectual disability are sexually insatiable. Social myths and attitudes can restrict victims' access to justice after experiences of sexual violence and abuse. For example, beliefs that people with intellectual disability are not competent to give evidence in court. People with intellectual disability would be overwhelmed by the legal process, therefore it is not in their best interests to take legal action.
Thank you for completing Topic 3, Vulnerability to Sexual Violence. Next, Topic 4 will look at perpetrators of sexual violence. But first, please return to the home page to complete the learning activity.